Welcome to Hyperfixation Investigations, the podcast where two neurospicy best friends take time 2 Saturdays a month to info dump their research deep dive of the week.
Lovingly produced and copyrighted by Wolf and Stag Productions.
Today's fun fact is Commonwealth Bay in Antarctica has been listed by both Guinness Book of World Records and National Geographic Atlas as the windiest place on Earth, with an average annual wind speed of 80 kilometers per hour, or 50 miles per hour, and regularly exceeding 240 kilometers per hour, or 150 miles per hour.
Good evening, I'm Kara, and I will be leading this week's episode, The Anemoi, the Wise and Winsome Winds.
Good morning, I'm Josh, and I'm just along for the ride. For those of you joining us for the first time, how things work here is Kara will be guiding us through a mini lecture on the topic, and we will discuss and ask questions about today's topic throughout the episode.
Expect tangents throughout. We switch off duties each episode, so next time, expect Josh to helm the episode.
Now to our regularly scheduled program. Kara, what have you been hyperfixating on this week?
Well, Josh, we're all going to enjoy a breath of fresh air and learn a bit about the Anemoi.
And the puns begin.
So they do. For those of you who don't know, the Anemoi are the Greek gods of wind. And we're also going to talk a bit about Aeolus, or Aeolus, who is keeper of the winds.
Is that how it's pronounced?
I don't know. I saw different pronunciations when I looked it up, so...
Okay. Because I've always just said Aeolus, which I feel like is more very American.
We can go with that.
No. You say how you're going to say it, because I'm just going to think of aioli every time if we say it my way.
Like the sauce?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Anywho, sorry. Go on.
No, you're good. I just want to point out, we don't normally mention the parts or the miniseries in our intro, but I feel like I need to warn you all. I feel like this miniseries title is a good warning for what's about to come. So this episode is part 1 of the miniseries. Yes, we were those Greek mythology kids.
Yeah.
So have fun with that.
Did we read copious Percy Jackson growing up?
And have the giant big table book of Greek mythology? What? We're also going to breeze through some general information and then follow that airstream onto mentions of the gods and myths and nerdy things like the etymology of the word anemoi and where we see influence of the anemoi and Aeolus in modern times.
I feel like some of these wind puns have a little too much gusto behind them.
Oh, that was good.
Thank you.
That was good. Before we dive in, Josh, what do you know about the Greek gods of the wind off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, not as much as I would like to know.
Mm-hmm.
I think I remember Aeolus being not necessarily always a god of winds, but in like different stories eventually getting that title.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember there being also Boreas or Boreas
mm-hmm.
and a couple other wind gods based on like the direction of wind, the north wind, south wind, east and west winds. I seem to remember Aeolus being kind of in charge of them, depending on the story. And they each have like cloud nymphs and other kinds of air-based nymphs that either work for them or with them, but I don't remember enough of all of their stories.
Oh, for sure. And we're not going to get into all of them either.
No. I mean, hell, most of the time with Aeolus, I mostly just think of the Odyssey because giving the wind bag
We'll talk about it.
Yes.
So you have a lot of the basic information down, so we'll just get into it a little bit more.
And I'm sure I remember more that I just...
don't realize you remember.
Right.
Yeah. Or can't pull off the top of your head.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So the Anemoi are minor gods, and they are considered subject to the god Aeolus when he is represented as a god.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, they're considered kind of under the control of Aeolus when he's called the Wind Keeper.
Oh,
and when he's the Wind Keeper and he's not a god, he's like sort of a demigod, sort of a blessed mortal.
Like, depending on the story, he might be some god's son or... Okay.
Yep. They were sometimes represented as gusts of wind. Other times they were personified, usually men with wings.
Sure.
They're sometimes depicted as horses, most famously as the horses that pull Zeus's chariot.
Of course.
There are reports in history of the Spartans sacrificing horses to the winds on Mount Taygetus.
Huh.
And they are said to be the children of Astraeus, the god of astrology, and titled often the father of the winds, and Eos, who is the Greek goddess of dawn.
Right. Right. Okay.
Yes.
Which it is funny how much overlap there is between so many different gods.
Oh, yeah.
Or like where you would expect there to be, well, you have a sun god.
Right.
Why do you need a god of the dawn?
Right. Let's talk about Helios, Apollo, and Eos all at the same time, shall we? Only a little repetitive there.
No.
One of the interesting things that kind of popped up throughout my research on this too was that this idea of like the parentage and descendancy and family trees of the gods was largely due to the poets and epic writers Homer and Hesiod.
Oh.
They're kind of the ones that put it to paper how the family genealogy of the gods worked. So we see this idea of the parentage of the wind gods being Astraeus and Eos from Hesiod.
Okay.
So there are 4 chief Anemoi: Boreas, who is the north wind, bringer of cold winter air. Zephyrus is the west wind, bringer of light spring and early summer breezes. You have Notus, who is the south wind and bringer of storms of late summer and autumn. And Eurus, the southeast, or to some, just the east wind. There's some different representations of them depending on which author you are reading.
You get a north, south, west, and southeast.
Yeah.
Cool. Very, very Greek.
And Eurus in ancient literature, like Homer and Hesiod, was not associated with Greek seasons the way the other 3 were, because largely spring was not really a thing in the Mediterranean. So he's not mentioned as tied to a season in Hesiod's Theogony or in the Orphic hymns, which we'll get into in a little bit. We're mostly going to focus on the Greek representations, but we're just going to briefly talk about Roman mythology, since these things are very similar.
Yeah, they share some ties.
Just a little.
Yeah.
But people may have heard of them through their Roman name, which was the Venti, which in Latin means winds. They have different names than the Greeks, but were essentially very, very similar to the Greek counterparts, attributes, and often being confused as the same one in crossovers. And Ptolemy's world map listed the 12 winds from the Venti.
Ptolemy? That Ptolemy?
Uh-huh.
Nice.
Yep. You have Septentrio of the north. The 12 makes it a very complicated compass rose, right? So it's Septentrio of the north, Aquilo of the north-northeast.
Oh, no.
Volturnus of the northeast, Subsolinus from the east, Eurus, and this is where we see Eurus as the southeast.
Okay.
Euro-Auster as the southeast, Austernotus as the south, Euronotus as the south-southwest, Africus as the southwest, Zephyrus as the west, another version of Euros as the northwest, and Circeus as the north-northwest. Now, we are not going to talk about all of those. And that's a lot of names, and nobody has to remember them. But you can see there's a bit of a theme with how these were named, with TUSs and NUSs at the end. A lot of the idea of Euro and Auster. You can guess where Europe and Australia came from, can you not?
Yep.
So some things like that. Then we're going to mainly focus on the 4 cardinal directions. We'll touch very briefly on the 4 Greek lesser wind gods, which are northeast, southeast, northwest, southwest.
Sure.
But again, our main focus today will be on the cardinal 4.
Okay.
So we're going to start with Boreas, and he was the god of the north wind, as I mentioned, considered the harshest of the Anemoi. He is mostly known in myth for his abduction of the Athenian princess Orythea, by whom he became the father of the Boreads.
Right.
Which we've talked about some stars and things like that called the Boreads. In art, he's typically depicted as a bearded older man. There are myths where he and Orythea lived in Thrace as king and queen of the winds. They had sons and daughters. There are stories from Herodotus where Boreas wrecked the fleet of the Persian king Xerxes off the beach of Sepius in Thessaly. And in return, the Athenians built him a sanctuary and altar near the Ilissus and held a festival in his honor.
Damn. All right.
Yeah. So in terms of the myths, Boreas and Zephyrus, who we're going to talk about next, largely show up the most. So that's the north wind and the west wind. The others show up, obviously, but when it comes to myths about individual winds, it tends to be Boreas or Zephyrus. There's a lot more on Zephyrus.
Okay, that's fair. I will say, Boreas, just the name, I always think of boreal forests.
Yep, or the Aurora Borealis, which is north.
Right.
Dawn of the north. And Eos, the goddess of dawn, their mother, in Roman is sometimes called Aurora.
Oh, of course.
So, yeah. So Zephyrus, sometimes shortened to Zephyr, right? Which we actually see as a name that people name their children and things like that in today's day and age.
Oh, yeah.
Is the Greek god of the west wind and often considered the gentlest of the winds, messenger of spring. And it's thought that Zephyrus, when he wasn't involved in things with Aeolus or Zeus, lived in a cave in Thrace.
Interesting, in a cave.
Uh-huh. There are lots of different stories about him, and depending on the story, depends on what wife he has. Some think he is the husband of Iris, the goddess of rainbow.
Uh-huh.
Some think he abducted Chloris and gave her the domain of flowers. Other people think it was Flora, who was a nymph. Some say he married a harpy.
Oh.
Yeah. And he is said to be the father of Balius and Xanath, who are Achilles' horses.
Okay.
And the Iliad and all that.
Getting your horses directly from the wind.
Yes.
Yeah.
Zephyrus is also somewhat associated with like messages and transportation. One of the most famous Greek myths of Eros and Psyche. Zephyrus is the one who brought Psyche to Eros's mountain abode. And there are other things like both Boreas and Zephyrus were called upon in the Iliad to help with the funeral pyres of Patroclus and Achilles and other heroes whose funeral pyres would not burn. Iris and other goddesses went to the winds and were like, hey, please burn the heroes.
Yeah.
So they can have proper burial, rites and all of that.
Love to see the wind gods helping a queer couple get a proper burial.
Yes, right? Love it so much. They were just friends.
Yeah,
yes. Friends.
Yes,
Best
totally.
friends.
I do love their story arc in the Hades video game.
Oh, yeah.
Because you can help them find each other again.
Nice.
It's very cute.
So that's kind of an overview on Zephyrus. We'll move on to Notus, who is the south wind, associated with hot winds, obviously, and typically actually connected to the rise of the Sirius constellation after midsummer.
Ah, okay.
And he was thought to bring storms of late summer and early autumn. Sometimes was viewed as destructive, destroyer of crops, but there is some differing ideas about destructive winds.
Okay.
Some people think these cardinal winds were beneficial. Myths and ancient writers and stuff viewed the cardinal winds as beneficial, and storm winds, deadly winds that come off of the sea, things like that, were actually the children of Typhus, Typhoon, the titan of like seas and storms and stuff.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah. So largely they're viewed as beneficial, benevolent.
Even the benevolent gods have bad days.
Always. So with Notus, again, his Roman Venti name was Auster. So Auster named the compass point Australis and the country Australia, and they're mentioned in Virgil's Aeneid Book 2. So it's just interesting which, he shows up a little bit more in Roman myth than he shows up in Greek myth. I think what my favorite fact throughout this whole research process was learning that Australia was named for the Roman equivalent of the southern wind god as like the most southern living continent. You know, it's cool.
No, that's very fun.
Yeah.
I think, and I could be misremembering, but I seem to remember Auster is like the root of the Germanic southern cardinal direction word.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because I think of Auster and I think of a word like Austerly, which means plain or simple.
Oh, sure.
And it's like, which ones come from where? All these Latin roots and whatever. You have austere.
Yes.
Stuff like that. Does that come from I don't know. I could research it. I'm not going to.
Right.
So our final cardinal direction is Eurus, which is, again, either the east wind, sometimes considered the southeast wind. We're going to talk about later on the Tower of Winds in Athens.
Ooh.
And on the Tower of Winds, Eurus occupies the southeast side, while Apoleotus is on the south, or is on the east, pardon me.
Apoleotus, all right.
Yes. However, it's widely accepted by some classicists and other ancient writers more modern than Homer and Hesiod that Eurus is the east wind, while Apoleotus is the southeast wind. So they're kind of interchangeable, honestly.
Okay. They get a lot of overlap, a lot of the same play.
Yeah.
Fair enough. I feel like that ends up happening a lot in myth, especially the longer it goes on.
Right. We'll talk very briefly later about the science of wind, but typically wind and storms and weather move west to east. Mm-hmm. So it's rarer that you have something coming from the east.
Sure.
You're in the Mediterranean where spring is a thing, but not really. And so you don't really consider it a season in ancient times. So, it's like, okay, there's a lot of confusion over this one because he's not talked about the same way the other three are.
Right. Because the latitude they're at, it just...
Yeah.
West wind gets more.
Mm-hmm. Right. He is often associated with the god Helios because Helios's palace, the Pantheon, is set at such a direction that the sun rises in the east.
Okay.
So there is that connection.
Sure. So are they typically depicted as like allies or as...
No, what it has on here is just that they're related in passages from Dionysiaca.
Oh.
Who wrote Nonus, which is an ancient poem and text.
Okay.
And, it makes sense since they're coming from kind of the same direction, and mother being Dawn and uncle being Helios.
Oh, right. So Helios' uncle, okay. Right. That does make sense, especially if you have people tied to those directions to say, well, yeah, obviously they're related.
Right. When it came to ancient pagan and religious tradition, black lambs were offered as sacrifices to the destructive winds, which again, some say are the sons of Typhoeus.
Sure.
And white ones to the favorable or good winds, which were the four that we've been talking about. It's said that Boreas had a temple on the river Ilissus in Attica, and between Titan and Sicyon, there's an altar of the winds, which is typically where this sacrifice happened.
Okay.
Zephyrus also had an altar on the sacred road to Eleusis, I believe. So that's kind of our basic overview of the big four cardinal direction winds.
Sure.
Now we're going to talk just very briefly, go over what the lesser winds of those four mid-directions were.
Northeast, southeast, northwest, southwest.
Right. They show up on the Tower of the Winds, which again we'll talk about in more detail in a little bit. And so that's why I want to go over it. We're going to have images of them up on the website and stuff like that. So I don't want everybody to just be like, why are there 8 images of this thing? And we only talked about 4.
That's fair.
So you have Cacius or Cassius, depending on your pronunciation, which is the Greek deity of the northeast wind. He is shown as a bearded man with a shield full of hailstones.
Oh.
On this tower.
Fun.
Apoleotus or Apheliotis from the roots of the rising sun. So southeast or east, again, he's the one that kind of gets interspersed with Euros.
Sure. I do love, though, was that like an epitaph or title, The Roots of the Rising Sun?
Yeah, no, it's just the name means from the rising sun.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It was thought that he created a refreshing rain for farmers. Often he's depicted wearing boots and carrying fruit and is clean-shaven with curly hair. Then we've got Skiron, who is the wind which blew from the Skirian rocks, which is a geographical feature near Canetta in the west of Athens.
Sure.
He appears on the northwest side, so his wind comes from the northwest. And it's said that his name is related to Skirophorion, the last of the 3 months of spring in the Attic calendar. He's depicted with a tilted cauldron representing the onset of winter.
Tilted cauldron?
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's a passage. I didn't end up including it in the notes, but that just piqued my memory on it. A passage, I think it was from Virgil. It was one of the Roman epic writers.
Sure. So Virgil's a safe bet, but you never know.
Mentioning Medea praying and harnessing the gods.
Oh.
Like doing a whole ritual around dancing around and harnessing the gods. And that just brought that to mind.
Yeah.
And then I haven't been able to verify this, but the one site where I found this said Lips is the Greek deity of the southwest wind, often depicted holding the stern of a ship. Oh. His Roman equivalent is Africus, so that's probably the more known, Yeah,
weirdly.
And the name is actually thought to be derived from the name of a North African tribe, the Afri.
Oh.
So Afri became before Africa.
Right.
But yeah, so that's kind of our overview of the 8 wind gods. And now we're going to talk a little bit about Aeolus. Just very briefly, because we'll get into some of the myth later on.
Oh, fun.
But this is just kind of the basic overview for him. So Aeolus is the son of Hippotas, who is like a demigod, I believe, or a minor god himself. Mm-hmm. And there is a lot of, there's kind of 2 different distinctions, as we mentioned before. There are myths in which Aeolus is a god. There are ones in which he is a mortal son that's blessed by the gods. Some say Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, is the grandson of the mortal Aeolus. So it's kind of all over the place.
Wait. So the wind god is the grandson of the mortal.
Right. It make sense, right?
Who was himself the son of either a god or demigod, which makes him either a demigod or demigod.
Right.
Sure. Which
so
not that demigod
is
really a thing. There's not a lot of
clarification on this.
Cool.
But regardless, Aeolus was considered the ruler of the winds. Of course, as you mentioned before, the most famous encounter is that of Odysseus in Homer's Odyssey. Mm-hmm. In the Odyssey, Aeolus was the king of the island Aeolia, where he lived with his wife and 6 sons and 6 daughters, and we're not going to talk about that because there is some not safe for work information about that myth.
No.
To ensure safe passage home for Odysseus, Aeolus gave a bag containing all of the winds except the gentle west wind Zephyrus to Odysseus, and told not to open it under any circumstances, kind of like a Pandora's box situation. Mm-hmm. But when they were almost home, Odysseus's men, thinking it had treasure inside of it, opened the bag, and it pushed them all the way back to Aeolus's island, where he then refused to help him because he thought that them showing back up at the island and the men opening the bag was a bad portent from the gods, that the gods did not support Odysseus and his men.
There are so many problems in the Odyssey that are so easily avoidable.
Yes.
If everyone could just keep their cool for 5 seconds.
Oh, hubris and greed, man. Hubris and greed.
Oh, yeah. We could literally open this bag of treasure when we get home.
Yeah.
Captain's telling us not to open the bag.
Right.
Hey, guys.
Let's open the bag.
I'm going to open the bag.
Yep. So, in the Odyssey, the kingdom of Aeolia was purely mythical, and it was a floating island surrounded by a wall of unbreakable bronze, and it was floating on the ocean. Mm-hmm. Later, you come to associate Aeolia with Aeolian Islands, which are north of Sicily, in the real world. He's also mentioned in Apollonius of Rhodes' Argonautica, where at the request of Hera, he calmed all the winds but the steady west wind of Zephyr to aid Jason and the Argonauts on their journey home.
Similar.
Yep. And in
the
Virgil's Aeneid, or Aeneid, I can never pronounce that one, Aeolus keeps the winds contained in a cave on Aeolia, which might be where you would get this Zephyrus lived in a cave idea.
I would assume it's Aeneid. I mean, again, I don't know. It's all Greek to me, man.
One of my favorite sources, as you guys know, I like to kind of highlight one of my major sources from my research during each of my episodes. Our big resource from this one is the book Wind, Nature and Culture by Louise M. Pryke, and specifically Chapter 3. The whole book gets into all sorts of different cultures and their associations with wind, but Chapter 3 has a lot about the Greek association.
Nice.
So there's a few quotes that I'm just going to pull very quickly for you guys in this one. Quote, in the classical world, the Anemoi were 4 wind deities who feature in numerous myths with the Greek word ene relating to breath. The connection between wind, breath, and life, or spirit, is found in diverse cultures throughout history, from Homer's The Odyssey to the modern day, and wind has played a prominent role in myths involving seafaring. Obviously.
Really? Why?
Really?
It's not like they use the wind to fill their sails.
Strange.
Yes.
And you have Poseidon seizing control of the winds, manipulating the winds in the Odyssey as well.
Yep.
Again, you have the whole Aeolus thing. So there were also a few other aspects or symbols or associations of wind that Pryke touches on. One of them being the wind and divinity. The Ori were nymphs of the wind.
Right, the Ori.
Who were considered swift-winged and wild.
Mm-hmm.
The sky god Zeus, depicted riding a chariot pulled by the four winged horses that, again, were considered personifications of the wind. They're also associated with fertility. There are a lot of Greek myths of horses being impregnated by the wind, by fertile winds.
I mean, I guess that makes sense for the sake of, hey, they're fast animals, so ride like the wind, bullseye.
Classical writers and medieval authors also thought that birds could become impregnated with wind eggs. And this is a quote from her book as well. Quote, as noted by Aristotle in the History of Animals, we have cases well authenticated where chickens of the common hen and goose have laid wind eggs without ever having been subjected to copulation. Wind eggs are smaller, less palatable, and more liquid than true eggs and are produced in greater numbers.
Okay.
And Aristotle thought that birds could take fertilizing breaths of the Zephyrus, the west wind.
You know what? That's kind of fun.
Yeah, right? And then we had briefly touched on this too. There's a myth about Zephyrus and his marriage to either Chloris or the nymph Flora. It kind of depends on which myth you're reading.
Sure.
In Ovid's Fausti, Zephyrus is said to have given Flora power over all flowers as the marital gift.
Huh.
Yes, which kind of still goes along with fertilization, but also goes with marriage.
Right. I mean, how often throughout various mythological sources are flowers used as
representations of things had to do with that.
Right. Yes. Either fertilization itself or genitalia or both.
So we're just going to briefly cover some of the mentions of Homer and Hesiod and Aristotle outside of what we've already talked about with the Odyssey and the Iliad.
Sure.
And then we'll probably take a break. So this is a quote from the Iliad, which is Homer. Often the winds were paired together, just as Boreas and Zephyrus blackened the cresting wave, so Eurus and Notus drove the surging waters before them. And the whole assembly surged like big waves at sea, the Icarian Sea, when east and south winds drive it on, blasting down in force from the clouds of Father Zeus, or when the west wind shakes the deep-standing grain with hurricane gusts that flatten down the stalks. So, yeah, gotta love epic writers, right?
I love this kind of evocative writing.
Yeah. Hesiod has a quote that strong-hearted winds, brightening Zephyrus and Boreas, headlong in his course, and Notus, a goddess mating in love with a god. Hesiod is the one where there's kind of no mention of Eurus.
Interesting.
So then we've got a mention from Aristotle, who, and what I'm about to talk about, there will be images of this up on the website. In the 4th century, there were 8 principal winds, which are the 8 that we've talked about, and Aristotle arranged them around a circle representing the horizon, much like a wind rose shows the direction of the wind. Opposite winds blew in opposite seasons. And this is from a University of Chicago article in which they're talking about the Tower of the Winds, but this is a quote from the article. The winds, therefore, have a particular place of origin and a defined direction, each a distinct entity and blowing in a definite course. Wood, who is a researcher mentioned in the article, provides an analogy for the 3 distinct meanings of wind in Greek. A wind is analogous to a river, and in that sense has a distinct origin. Wind in the abstract as the stream in that river, and the wind as the current or movement of that stream.
Okay.
Which is how we get this compass rose idea and the 8 sides of the Tower of the Wind, which we'll talk about. So I'm going to have both a kind of Greek version of the wind rose, which is in Greek, and I'll have an English one as well so that people can kind of see where those things line up.
Hell yeah.
And so then finally in this section, in terms of myths and legend and all of that, we have the Orphic hymns to the wind.
Yes.
So Orphic hymn 80 is to Boreas. Quote, to Boreas, fumigation from frankincense. Boreas, whose wintry blasts terrific tear the bosom of the deep surrounding air. cold icy power approach and favoring blow, and Thrake a wild desert exposed to snow. The air's all misty darkening state dissolve with pregnant clouds whose frames and showers resolve. Serenely temper all within the sky and wipe from the moisture aether's splendid eye. So, really cool writing. I'm not going to read all of them to you guys, but I really suggest if you like Shakespeare and like Shakespearean sonnets and stuff, translations of the Orphic hymns to the winds are up there. They're really cool. 81 is to Zephyrus and 82 is to Notus. And again, the Orphic hymns existed before this idea of Euros is the east wind and all of that. They're like 3rd century BC to 2nd century AD. So old, but they're really cool. Very pretty.
Yeah, always love some nice poetry.
Yes. So I think this is a good spot to take a break. This was a lot of information, and I know like the Greek stuff can be overwhelming because, as you said, it's all Greek to us.
Well, especially once you get into like, okay, this particular location next to this place at these islands that we don't really have, a reference for mentally.
For sure.
We're not used to those landmarks.
Yep. But yeah, I think we're going to head over to intermission. And then after intermission, we'll talk a little bit more about etymology and some physical ancient examples of the wind gods. And then we'll move on to where else we see their influence in other kind of areas of life and in modern media.
Hell yeah.
Yes. Well, after that long-winded section, I could use a breather.
We are excited to let you know that we are now streaming our episodes on YouTube. You can find all our prior episodes already up, and new episodes will update just like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. For those of you who appreciate social media updates and episode reminders, please follow us on YouTube at Hyperfixation Investigations Podcast or on Blue Sky at High-Podcast. Or sign up for our email list at our website to ensure you never miss a thing.
And please leave a comment or review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, or even on our website. We love to hear from you, and it helps us a lot. If you'd like to contribute to us directly and help us continue growing, consider subscribing to our podcast on Patreon. Also, for those visual learners or folks with any kind of hearing impairment or audio processing disorder, we now have episode transcripts available on our website, as well as Apple Podcasts and YouTube. Spotify is out of our control, unfortunately. We just have to wait for them to add that ability for all their creators. Now that I've caught my breath, let's get back to our mind-blowing topic. So I don't know about you guys, but I have an etymology lover in my house. Hi, Mom. So things like where words came from are interesting to me. So we're going to talk very briefly about some of the etymology around Anemoi and Aeolus and things like that. But we're just going to do a brief thing because you could do a lot about it, but we don't need a lot.
We could probably make episodes upon episodes upon episodes
about etymology.
Most of these.
Yes. So Ane, which is A-N-E, is a Proto-Indo-European root, also known as a pi, meaning to breathe.
Mm-hmm.
There's hypothetical sources and evidence of its existence in Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Old Irish, Welsh, the Gothic Uzanen, Old Norse, Old English, Old Church Slavonic, Armenian, and more. And this comes from D. Harper and the etymology of Anemoi from their etymology dictionary.
Gotcha.
So when you have this idea of Ane, A-N-E, and the fact that all of those examples of languages that I just read out to you, typically the words in those languages related to Ane mean things like wind, soul, life, breath, spirit, exhale, things like that.
Right, where you can see how over time, as languages grew apart and became more distinct, similar sounds and concepts would develop into related but similar sounds and concepts.
Yep.
Pulling them apart little bit by little bit.
Yep.
For
example, in Latin, which is probably one of the ones that people will have recognized, is animus, which means rational soul, mind, life, mental powers, consciousness, sensibility, etc. Anima, which is a living being, a soul, a mind. Little side tangent. I sang in a professional children's chorus when I was growing up, and it was originally called the Glenellan Children's Chorus, GECC, GEC. And while I was in the chorus, they decided to change their name because a lot of us were not from Glenellan. We were from a much wider area of the Chicago western suburbs. And so they changed the name of the chorus to Anima, meaning like breathing life, breathing soul. And then, there's a whole subtitle to the rest of the name of the chorus. But that's where my kind of knowledge of Anima first started.
That's very fun.
Yes. But when we go to the Greek, which is the Anemos, we see the Anemoi, obviously, the Anemoi, which is wind. But we also see something like the anemometer.
Anemometer?
Yes, which is a wind gauge.
Oh, sure.
It indicates the velocity of the wind. And we also have things like anemone. Now, anemone is both a flowering plant and a sea creature, but the flowering plant comes from the French anemone, which is directly from the Latin anemone, which is from the Greek anemone, which means windflower. Literally means daughter of the wind.
I kind of love that.
Yeah, from Greek, anemos, wind. So that's our little mini etymology lesson for the day.
So Nemo and Father Marlin live in a windflower.
Yes, they do.
Underwater.
They do indeed. So just like I just mentioned the wind gauge, we're going to go off on a little tangent and talk about wind science.
Ooh, yes.
How does wind work? We're going to do this very basically, I promise. So wind occurs when there's a difference in air pressure between one area of the Earth's surface and another. Now, this comes from a really simple and very useful Farmer's Almanac article. Sometimes this difference in pressure is very minor, which is a gentle breeze, and other times it's very great, which is often violent winds that can move, like you said, faster than 250 miles per hour.
Woohoo!
Yes. According to this article, the fastest wind ever recorded was clocked at 253 miles per hour on April 10th, 1996 on Barrow Island, Australia.
Dang.
Yes.
Dang.
Because of Earth's rotation, air does not move in a straight line from the points of highest pressure to the points of lowest pressure. It pushes the air often to the right. And so this phenomenon is called the Coriolis effect. And it causes air to flow clockwise around high pressure areas in the northern hemisphere and counterclockwise around low pressure areas. And then the reverse happens in the southern hemisphere. So that's your little wind science.
Which is also part of why typhoons and hurricanes have different spin patterns.
Right. So one of the really kind of important things, which I had mentioned before when it comes to representation of the Greek wind gods, is the Tower of the Winds. Now, this is a building in Athens. It was erected between 150 BCE by Andronicus of Cyrus, and it was created to measure time. It's an octagonal marble structure that is 42 feet high and 26 feet in diameter. The 8 sides, because it's an octagon, face the compass and the midpoints of a compass. And it has frieze of figures in relief that represent the different winds that blow from the corresponding directions.
Nice.
And on the sides that face the sun, so east and west, there are lines for a sundial, which is part of how it was used to tell time.
So, hang on, are the frieze on, like, if I'm on the northern side?
Yes, you're seeing Boreas.
And I'm looking at it, I'm seeing Boreas?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm not looking north, I'm looking south, but I'm at the northern
tip of it. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
There's also a weather vane of bronze Triton, which contains a water clock, which is a clepsydra, on top of it. And this was put on later, but I'm not sure exactly when.
Sure.
And this was used to record time when the sun was not out. And there will be an image of all the sides and the Triton up on our website. So this piece has been mentioned and reconstructed and illustrated in kind of fanciful ways for a long time. But James Stewart and Nicholas Rivette's The Antiquities of Athens is actually the first time accurate images were created. And this was in 1762. And James Stewart was an architect and a builder and was very influential himself in the Greek revival period of architecture. And he built the landscaped pairs of sculptures that took their inspirations from the Tower of the Winds. James Stewart himself built some notable versions that were influenced by the Tower of the Winds, including a landscaped pair of towers at Shugborough, Staffordshire, England in 1764, and another in Mount Stewart, County Down, Ireland in 1782. There's also James Wyatt's more imaginative Radcliffe Observatory Tower in Oxford, England, which is somewhat famous, built in 1776.
Okay.
So it had some of its influence from Greek Revival architecture and the Tower of the Winds.
I did not know that.
A really interesting read, and I wasn't able to get full access to the book without buying it, and so I'm sorry I didn't buy it. But there's a really good summary excerpt of this book, and the book is called The Tower of the Winds in Athens, Greeks, Romans, Christians, and Muslims, 2 Millennia of Continual Use, written by Pamela Webb. I'm going to read very briefly the summary, part of the summary that was listed, because it's a really interesting idea to think of with this tower in particular. Quote, the Tower of the Winds has stood in the shadow of the Acropolis in Athens for more than 2,100 years, 2,100 years. This tall, octagonal building, which was one of the best preserved monuments from the classical period, is discussed by the ancient authors Vitruvius and Varro. Their documents reveal it was built by the architect-astronomer Andronicus of Kairos, and that it functioned as a horologion, a term that was applied both to sundials and water clocks. As one of the rare examples of material evidence from the realm of classical science, the monument has been analyzed previously almost entirely in regard to its form and function in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. Consequently, almost all of its features have been attributed to the period of construction by the Greeks or renovations made by the Romans. The building, however, was in use almost continuously for 2 millennia, which includes Byzantine and Ottoman phases. Webb examines the tower throughout its entire functional existence, expanding on the earlier research and exploring its use by Christians as a matrium for one of the apostles and by Muslim whirling dervishes who may have continued to honor a Christian cult at the location.
Interesting.
So, really cool. Again, I'll have pictures. And this is where we get a lot of the Boreas had a beard, and one of the minor ones held a shield of hailstones or a cauldron or whatever is from these frieze on the Tower of the Winds.
Sure, because these are the main depictions that are surviving.
Right.
That's fair. Nice.
So we're going to step a little bit away for a second from the idea of the Anemoi and the Greek gods of wind. And we're going to talk about where we see this idea of wind playing out in other areas of life.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the first places we're going to talk about, or first things we're going to talk about, is the Aeolian harp. Now you can see where it got its name.
Oh.
Aeolus.
Okay.
Aeolian harps are also called wind harps because they are played by the wind. And we're actually going to have a clip of one being played on our website. So I highly suggest going and listening. They are very eerie sounding, which is really cool. It's the only string instrument to be played solely by the wind. It therefore also only plays harmonic frequencies, which is part of what creates the eerie sound I mentioned, because it's all overtones.
Right.
It's usually made of a wooden box with a sounding board and strings attached lengthwise across 2 bridges, and it's often placed in a window or someplace where wind can blow across the strings to produce the sounds. There are no percussive aspects like you would find in wind chimes.
Sure.
So crescendos and decrescendos are played to the rhythm of the wind.
I love that.
Yes. The strings on a typical Aeolian harp can be made of various materials and thicknesses, and they can be tuned to the same pitch or different ones. And you don't always have to stick with wooden strings. Sometimes you get giant ones, which we're going to talk about later. And they're made of metal. Were the strings to be plucked, they would produce a fundamental frequency, like when you hit a note on a piano. And you have a central sound, a central note.
Yeah.
That's the fundamental frequency. You know, those always have overtones to them, but we're not going to get into sound science that much.
Sure.
But when the string oscillates due to the wind, it doesn't create the fundamental frequency. It only creates fractions of the frequency in halves, thirds, quarters, fifths, eighths, twelfths. And this produces the overtones. This is called the von Karman vortex street effect. Gotta love it.
What a name.
Yep. The motion of wind across a string causes periodic vortices to go downstream, and the alternating vortex causes the string to vibrate. Just for reference, you can sometimes see this or hear it with overhead utility lines. If you hear an overhead utility line kind of doing the high-pitched overtone weird sound, it's this effect happening very fast. And if you see them moving, it's this effect happening very slow.
Nice.
So just for reference to kind of visualize what it is I'm talking about with these. Since it's played without human intervention, the Aeolian harp is considered a form of aleatoric music, which is music where an element of the composition is left to chance, or primary elements of the work is left to the determination of its performer. You can't get much more chance than the wind.
No. The wind?
The wind?
Notoriously
The wind?
Unreliable and
Chaotic? What?
I love that.
Yes. So a little bit of just very brief history. It's been known to the ancient world for a very, very long time and was first described by Athanasius Kircher in the 1600s, but as it's existed far longer. Mm-hmm. It's been known and referenced and found in China, Ethiopia, Greece, India, Indonesia. It became a very popular household instrument in the Romantic era.
Nice.
And as I mentioned before, there are now some made from metal, and they are located on the roofs of buildings in windy hilltops. They play on their own. And then there are very big ones. And we're going to get to the very big ones after we talk about some other things first.
Oh, okay.
And there will be images of some of these big ones that we talk about on the website. And again, there'll be that YouTube video so you can kind of hear what one sounds like. We're going to divert to one of our favorite topics. I don't know if it's actually one of our favorite topics, but we're going to talk about the Windy City. So if anybody's from Chicago, you know, it's not called the Windy City because it's windy, but I'm going to briefly go over, just kind of paraphrase, the entry on the Encyclopedia of Chicago, which is run by the Chicago Historical Society and the Newberry Library. This is from Jonathan Boyd. Chicago's exposed location between the Great Plains and the Great Lakes means that there is a lot of wind that swirls amongst the city and its skyscrapers. And this does lend credence to the idea that our famous nickname from the late 1800s is because it's actually windy here. But we have a lot of proof that that isn't true because our climate is not distinctly windy, though the last few days, gods know, it's been crazy around here.
Yeah, at time of recording, it's been
very windy.
We've had a windy half week.
You might see where I got some inspiration for today's episode. So the nickname may actually come from the metaphorical use of the word windy for talkative or boastful. Chicago politicians were famous for being long-winded. A lot of cities during the 1800s were trying to self-promote themselves. These politicians and business people of these cities throughout the Midwest in particular were trying to boast themselves up as the Midwestern city.
Sure.
The next big city of the West, sort of a thing. And,
who could be New York of the Midwest?
Right. And Chicago's politicians and business people were notoriously famous for this. They were called boosters. And they, were doing this to secure investment, workers' participation in national projects like railroads, provisions for Civil War materials. But you can also see the use of this term, Windy City, in Cleveland in 1885 and Louisville in 1886 in their newspapers. So the idea of the Windy City has existed for a long time, and it probably was attributed to multiple cities in the Midwest during this time of trying to self-promote and bring in new resources and everything, and it just kind of stuck with Chicago, which is not surprising.
Makes sense.
Makes sense. So for our final kind of key section here, we're going to talk about where else we see this idea of either Anemoi or Aeolus and the idea of wind in slightly more abstract ways. Yes. And some slightly not abstract ways. So we have an example, and again, there'll be pictures of some of this stuff online.
Sure.
On our website. For example, the artist Robin White creates wire sculpture fairies. And she has an article on her website about creating one of her largest fairy pieces, which stands over 4 feet tall. And this fairy is very, very delicately perched up on, kind of on point, like a ballerina, on a dandelion with their wings outstretched trying to catch dandelion fluff.
Oh.
And the name of this fairy is Anemoi.
Lovely.
We also have, and I wish I could have found a video or a soundbite of people playing this, but I was not able to, which is so sad. There is a woodwind orchestration called Anemoi. It was composed in 2016 by Joseph Davies. And one sentence from his summary about the piece is the 4 linked movements of the piece depict the 4 chief winds and their effects upon the earth. And in his program summary, he goes into more detail about the Boreas section, the Zephyrus section, and why he chose certain instrumentation for each of those sections and certain rhythms and whatever. It's a very interesting little, very short read, but really cool to see how this composer's mind took this idea of the 4 winds and turned it into a woodwind orchestration and composition.
No, absolutely. I love seeing what it is that inspires artists.
Yes, it's so cool. And it was originally arranged and composed for the Youth Orchestra of Wales, I believe.
Oh.
Yeah, which I just thought was cool.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're going to talk about what I mentioned before, which is those giant Aeolian harps. Something to note about Aeolian harps, and you might notice this if you look at the images on our website, is they do not all look the same, because they don't need to really look like anything as long as the key components of the soundboard and the strings exist. So some look like very abstract sculptures, some look like a wooden box, and there's one in Britannia, Nova Scotia, I believe, that looks like a giant fiddle.
I love that.
But they all have the same physical basis, which is why they work as Aeolian harps.
They all work the same way. You can just make them look like a bunch of different stuff.
Yes. So the largest Aeolian harp in the world is now called the Lucia and Arsacides Demetrius wind harp in South San Francisco.
Mm.
It is 28 meters tall, which is 92-ish feet.
Dang.
Yes. It is very large. And it's on a hill over 74 meters above sea level, which again, for our Americans, is about 240 feet above sea level.
Sounds right.
So it always has a pretty substantial breeze to be playing all the time. There are others that are very large. One was built at Burning Man in 2003.
Why am I not surprised?
No, nobody is surprised by this. There's one in Negrar, which is a province of Verona, Italy. Mm-hmm. It has a copper harmonic case and 6 strings of different lengths, meaning they play different tones.
Sure.
And it can be heard from over 15 feet away, 4 meters away when it's played.
Nice.
There's a 22-foot tall one at the Exploratorium Museum in San Francisco. It has metal discs and a natural wind tunnel, so it's very loud when it plays. The one that looks like a giant fiddle I mentioned is the one in Cape Breton. I apologize, that's where it's from. Sydney, Nova Scotia on Cape Breton. It's 18 meters tall, 60 feet. It is 10 tons of steel.
Ooh!
And it doubles as the world's largest fiddle because it looks like a fiddle.
I love it.
And it was erected to honor the fiddling traditions and folk music of the region's Celtic population.
Oh.
It was unveiled in 2005 and for whatever reason, the Gaelic name of it did not come into my notes, but it translates in English to the big fiddle of the Celidí, or the Celiva, which translates to visit. So the big fiddle of the visiting.
Okay.
It's so large it can be seen by ships coming into the harbor on the island.
A giant fiddle as the shipping landmark.
Yes, we love it so much.
I love that. An instrument made out of a giant instrument.
Yep. Some other references of Aeolian harp related things. And again, just this idea of wind and wind music. There are stops on organs meant to imitate the sound of Aeolian harps. Chopin has the Etude in A-flat major, Opus 25, number 1 for piano, written in 1836, which was nicknamed the Aeolian Harp Etude by Robert Schumann. Homer relates that Hermes invented the lyre that was able to be played by the wind, and the same is said of the lyre of King David, which was played by the wind sent from God. And it's often referenced in Romantic era poetry. For example, the Ode to the Westy Wind by Percy Bysshe Shelley.
I do enjoy Shelley.
So, final section of where we see these things show up in other areas of life and media. There is a chapter of James Joyce's Ulysses titled Aeolus. I have no idea what it's about.
Okay.
I don't really care to find out. I just thought it was a cool title for a chapter.
Sure.
And from here on out, if you have not read the Percy Jackson books, including the original series or the Heroes of Olympus series, or if you have not listened to Epic the Musical sagas, whatever, skip or stop listening because this will be our end until the conclusion.
Or just be warned.
Yeah,
just
be warned. There's not much of a spoiler for the original series, but there are definitely spoilers for the Heroes of Olympus series for Percy Jackson.
Right.
So just everybody, you've been warned. So Percy Jackson and the Olympian series, because again, we were those Greek mythology kids.
Gods, yes. In many ways, still are.
Indeed. The Anemoi are mentioned in the last Olympian as defending Olympus from Kronos and the Titan army.
Mm-hmm.
And it's said that they are able to instantly transport themselves and prevented Titans from transporting directly to Olympus from far away.
Yes.
They also, again, were the steeds for Zeus's chariot, things like that. Now, where we see them a lot more is in the Heroes of Olympus series.
Gods, yes.
We love. So in The Lost Hero, we meet Boreas, the North Wind god, and his children, when Jason tries to find storm spirits that will guide them to Hera's prison. Aeolus also appears and is going to let them go, but Chione, who is a Greek goddess or nymph of snow and daughter of Boreas, tells Aeolus to kill Jason instead, and the team narrowly escapes with the help of the wind nymph Meli.
Yes.
The wind gods in this story had allied themselves to Gaia, who was kind of the villain and kind of just misunderstood, and it forces the team to leave Greece during the summer solstice.
Yes.
So it was a pretty big plot moment in these books.
Well, and if I remember correctly, part of the whole reason that Aeolus was so willing to help against the demigods was because he was frustrated about how the battle against Kronos went for his wind nymphs in particular, and how many storm spirits got released and how little help he had cleaning them up.
Yep.
Yes, which I think is supposed to be a reference to the original Titanomachy. And I don't remember if something similar actually does happen in the Titanomachy, or if Rick was just kind of spitting.
Right.
Just kind of going, yeah, it makes sense that...
Who is the author?
Yeah, yes. Rick Riordan, the author of that series. If he was just kind of going off of, well, it would make sense if something like this happened in those ancient stories, we could build on that idea.
Well, especially because if Typhoeus was the father of storm spirits, Typhoeus was released in the last Olympian series.
Exactly.
So you see that happening,
Yeah.
Yeah. We love Rick Riordan. He makes things canon that people tweet him that he likes.
Yes,
like
in the best way possible.
Yes,
right.
The one that I just saw recently, which I have no idea how old it actually is, but
Sure.
it came across my Pinterest the other day, was that the headcanon that the Hephaestus cabin make enchanted wheelchairs for disabled demigods.
Yes.
And Rick was like, yes, I love this. Yes, it's canon.
Right. Obviously.
Yeah, we love.
Approved.
Anyway, we will probably at some point end up having a whole mini-series about the Percy Jackson books because we're obsessed. Us? But anyway, there's one other book in the Heroes of Olympus series where we see some of this crossover with the wind gods. And that's in the House of Hades. And Jason and Nico encounter Favonius in Split. Now, you may be like, why does that sound familiar? Didn't she say that at some point in this episode? I did. Back at the beginning. Zephyrus's Roman Venti name is Favonius. And for anybody who hasn't read the series, there's a big thing in the House of Olympus about the fact that the Greek gods...
House of Hades?
In the whole series. In the Heroes of Olympus
Heroes
series.
of Olympus. So you said house.
Oh, well, yes, thank you. Okay. In the Heroes of Olympus series, where all of the gods have essentially kind of split personality disorders because they're sometimes Greek and sometimes Roman. And whereas there's a lot of crossover between those two, sometimes they're very different depending on if they're Greek or Roman. So Favonius meets them in Split. He leads them to Cupid, which also harkens to the Eros and Psyche story I mentioned earlier.
That's right.
And during that, they encounter Boreas's children again, and they land at Notus's palace, who is the South Wind. And he speaks to them about constantly having to choose and oscillate between the Greek and the Roman forms.
Right.
So that is our Percy Jackson roundup.
Though I will say, before we move on,
yes.
So sorry, I also just enjoy seeing, because a lot of Percy's story at various points mimics and mirrors Odysseus's.
Yeah.
So especially during Sea of Monsters.
Mm-hmm.
When,
oh, God, yeah.
Yeah. Where Hermes literally gives him, instead of a bag, a thermos of the winds trapped.
Yes. Yep.
And similarly, it gets opened when it wasn't supposed to be, and
it's a disaster.
Whoops. Do you have on there anything about the SpongeBob movie?
No.
Okay. I will say, I know, tangent of a tangent of a tangent. The original SpongeBob movie.
Yes. The one with, what's his face? Chris Christopherson?
David Hasselhoff?
David Hasselhoff.
Don't hassle the Hoff, man.
I get them screwed up all the time.
That's fair.
They're like astrology and astronomy to me.
Oh my God. You know what? Fair. Fine. Weirdly, I think Germany loves David Hasselhoff.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. But anywho, the SpongeBob movie that had, for some reason, a cameo by David Hasselhoff.
Yeah.
There are parts of it that are very clearly inspired by the Odyssey.
Yeah, I believe it.
Because one of the monsters they face is just a human in a diving suit, but it's an old-timey diving suit. So he's a cyclops.
Oh, yeah.
And Patrick and SpongeBob are given a bag of winds.
Good.
So
yes.
I just can't escape the thought of Bag of Winds without thinking back to that period of my childhood with just that movie, which also kind of makes, what was her name, Mandy? Mindy? Mandy? I think it was Mandy. Neptune's daughter who showed up to help them at one point. I think that would kind of technically make her simultaneously a stand-in for Aeolus and Athena. Because she was kind of acting as a guiding voice for them early on in their journey. Yeah. Like Athena was for Odysseus early in his. But anywho, take it away, please.
Well, the final thing we're going to talk about is Epic the Musical.
Yes.
Which is entirely based on Homer's The Odyssey.
Oh, yeah. And specifically Odysseus' journey from the Odyssey, which I feel like a lot of people don't realize is not the entire Odyssey.
Correct. It is not. So specifically from the Ocean Saga and the Wisdom Saga, because Epic the Musical is broken up into mini albums, essentially, and they're called sagas, and they have to do with different key events and parts of the storyline. We have the moments of Aeolus giving Odysseus a good wind with the bad winds in a bag, not to open. His crewmates open it. They get pushed back to the island. Interesting little tidbit. The composer thought that floating island meant floating in the sky.
Yes.
So that's an incorrect interpretation in Epic the Musical.
Yep. He literally, he went on, I don't remember what platform I saw him on afterwards.
Yes.
But online, speaking of, I thought they were flying. When you say floating island, obviously
they're
flying.
wind gods. I mean, It makes total sense.
Right. No, and I see how he got there. Yeah. It makes sense. It's just really amusing to know that floating island generally doesn't actually mean flying. It's just an island that is not moored to the ocean floor in any way.
Exactly.
And yet in the song, it's island in the sky.
Yep. And you're like, oh, okay. Okay.
I mean, I'm here for it.
Yep. So we have that whole section of Aeolus and the wind and giving the good winds, trapping the bad winds, etc. And Aeolus is shown to be mischievous and playful in the song Keep Your Friends Close, which is the one you mentioned.
Your friends close and your enemies closer.
Right, but not truly trustworthy.
Well, because in this particular adaptation, and I don't remember how it plays out in the Odyssey itself, but at least in this adaptation, some of the other wind nymphs are the ones who put the idea in the crew's head.
Yes.
That it's a bag of treasure.
And that you should open it.
Yeah.
And they do. And they get blown back towards not Aeolia as in the traditional story, but they get blown back toward the land of the giants by these unleashed winds.
The musical does kind of skip past the Lystrigonians. I think probably just because facing off against giants narratively feels a little too similar to
Cyclops.
The Cyclops.
Yeah, for sure.
Fair enough.
But yeah, so that's pretty much it from my end.
I had forgotten that wind harps were named after Aeolus.
Yeah.
Aeolian Harps. I don't think I have any questions off the top of my head that we didn't get to.
Cool. Well, in that case, let's wind down the episode.
With how many puns we have spread throughout this, I'm very excited to go back and listen to this in the edit.
Yeah, my dad would be so proud of me.
Of course. Gods.
But yeah, that's it. So that's your little mini lecture, get to know the Greek gods of the wind and the Wind Keeper.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
That's a wrap on episode 13, The Anemoi. If you'd like to delve further into this topic, our research, sources, and related images are posted on our website, hyperfixation-investigations.com. Again, that is hyperfixation-investigations.com. Thank you so much for listening.
Follow us on social media for updates, and check out our Patreon to support us directly, join our Discord community, and receive other special perks.
See you next week. And remember, what's a little info dumping between friends?